Thank you for keeping it Good Morning Kenya. I'm Jane Wamboy. If you're just joining us, karibu tena sana. Now we want to move on to the next discussion, and this is all about the life and times of the late Sir Mohinder Dhilloh. Remember, he passed on earlier on this week after a short illness. Of course, we'll be giving you more details about that. But to help us with this discussion this morning, we have with us two gentlemen who had the opportunity and honor of interacting with this gentleman, working with him to some extent, and they will be telling us more of that and how it has been since. And of course, you can talk to us using the hashtag Good Morning Kenya on Twitter. My handle is the Jane Wamboy. Our official station handle is at KBC Channel 1 TV. Now, to let you know who we have with us in studio this morning, to my immediate left, we have Hainga Okwemba, who is a presenter and a producer here at the Broadcasting House, but working with the English service. He is in charge of the Books Cafe segment on the English service. Karibu sana.
Asante.
Glad to have you this morning.
Thank you.
And to my extreme left, we have Richard Vaughan, who is a former BBC reporter, and of course, he's now currently the managing director of Inca Africa, which is a documentary-making company. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you
Glad
very much.
you made time.
Glad to be here.
All right. Once again, any questions, comments, clarifications, feel free to shoot them through via our communication platforms. Now, when we talk about Sir Mohinder, when you hear about Sir Mohinder, what comes to mind first? Let me start with you, Vaughan. Mr. Vaughan.
I worked with him on and off for a period of 25 years.
25 years.
From 1990 up until his retirement, effectively, around the year 2000, 2004, 2005. He was a camera operator. I was a documentary director.
Yeah.
He had an extraordinary physical courage. That's the thing I remember about him. He was not a formally trained cinematographer. He learned on the job. He had a very modest background. He didn't have much by way of formal education, but he made up for this with an extraordinary humanity and an extraordinary ability to deal with people in all walks of life. Whether he was dealing with a head of state, and he dealt with many, or whether he was dealing with the humblest street sweeper, he was the same. He never had any airs or graces. He was a very shy individual. He was hampered by quite a serious speech impediment. He had a bad stammer. But that did not get in the way of his incredible physical courage. He would go into some of the most aggressive, dangerous war zones in the world. And in Aden in particular, he was known by the British soldiers as Death Wish Dylan. Yeah, they were all hiding from the bullets, and he couldn't hide from the bullets. He was carrying a camera that weighed 20 kilos. You could not move. You couldn't dodge bullets when you're carrying a camera like that. But the story was paramount. And it was a miracle he survived. He had nine lives.
Years.
Yes. There was another occasion when he fell out of a helicopter at 8,000 feet.
Imagine.
Yeah. It was only the forest that broke his fall, and he survived that. So he was a very, very courageous man, both physically and also morally. He had tremendous moral courage as well. Very, very principled individual.
All right. Now, Okwemba, coming to you, what is it that you remember the most about Mr. Dhilloh?
Yeah, I first came to know Mohinder Dhilloh. Of course, I'd actually heard about him, but my first encounter with him was at a book launch. And so after the book launch, I went to see him. And at that time, he had actually retired from active journalism because he was already, this is a man who was born in 1931. So when I met him, he was already in his early 80s or mid-80s. And so I went to see him, to just greet him, because I knew that he's a gentleman who attracted a lot of admiration and respect from the people even in that hall. And I was surprised that as I tried to introduce myself to him, he already knew me. Because this was a gentleman who kept, even after retirement, he still kept in touch with what was happening, both locally and globally in the media scene. Then I had just joined KBC, but I was also still writing my column. I was a columnist with the Star newspaper. And so on that occasion, we exchanged, words. And I found him to be just a nice person, very interested in what was happening. And he was in the process of writing his book. That's a memoir that I would actually come to describe when it eventually came out as one of the most evocative memoirs that you'd ever come across, or one that has ever been produced by a Kenyan. It's such an amazing story. Even though he called it My Camera, My Life, I think it's actually, that title belies the story in that book, because it's a documentation of the history of Kenya's struggle for independence, and not just Kenya, but Africa, that struggle, the independence, and after. So it's an amazing story.
It is an amazing three-part story.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Now, let me come back to you, Mr. Vaughan. Having given that opportunity to have worked with him, he had a career that spanned over 60 years. But regardless of all the challenges that he had to face, he still stayed true to the cause and making sure that every story, every picture that he takes tells a story. And there's nothing more to it, nothing to do with money or any financial benefit or benefits that may come along with it. How does that resonate with you as a journalist?
Okay. As I say, he was responsible for recording the images. I was responsible for telling the story. So after many years together, we were like this.
Yeah.
We had an instinctive understanding of what of what either party wanted to do at any given time, particularly when time was short or when we were in a dangerous situation. The thing that strikes me about his approach is that he was a very modest human being by nature. He never wanted stardom. He never wanted to enjoy the limelight. In fact, it was only his family and friends who encouraged him to write his autobiography. Otherwise, I think he might have gone to his grave without doing so.
Yeah.
There's actually a second one that's going to be published fairly soon, which is a much smaller illustrated one. He knew every mover and shaker on this continent for half a century. He knew Jomo Kenyatta very well. Julius Nyerere, Robert Mugabe, Idi Amin. He worked at one time as court photographer for Haile Selassie.
Yeah.
He also knew Mother Teresa at the time then he was filming the Ethiopian famine in the mid-1980s. And in the 1990s, he was very well acquainted with Wangari Maathai. So he knew all the big people, if I can use that term, on this continent and elsewhere, in Aden and also in Vietnam, for a span of 50 years. So this autobiography is as much a history of Africa in the second half of the 20th century as it is a story of his own life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, there's a part where, when you get to what some of his previous interactions with other media houses, he actually talks of how he experienced some sort of racial segregation during one time that he was actually out there filming. Do you think this is one of the challenges that, kept him going and kept him wanting to do more for the people, to just try and bring down these barriers that were there back then?
Yeah, I suppose so, because, when he started, like Richard Vaughan has actually said there, that he is a gentleman who had this very modest education. Of course, when he came to Kenya to join his father, who was working with the East African Railway and Harbours at that time, in 1947. Then he was barely 16 years old.
Yeah.
And because he had actually grown up to that age in India, in the Punjab province. So when he came to Kenya, English was not a language that he spoke, that he understood. So the very first thing that he was supposed to do was actually to try and master English. And then, of course, he was enrolled at Jamhuri High School, but he didn't do very well. And when he left that school, it was like his future had just crashed. There was nothing that he was going to do because he didn't have a proper education. He didn't speak much English then. And then one time he actually, when he was just staying at home, he saw an advert in the newspaper saying that they needed an accountant. And because he had been staying with his father and he was becoming, he's this teenager who is actually left school, he doesn't have any hope of a better future. So he just, gave himself to apply for that job, knowing very well that was not a job that he had trained for. So he applied for a job at a studio called Hell Studio, run by a Jewish lady called Edith Heller. And so he went there. He didn't perform very well in the interview for the job, for the cashier or an accountant. But because, so when he was just about to leave, he noticed that this was not just a chemist, where they wanted him to actually offer this job of an accountancy, but they also they were doing this work for the studio.
Yeah.
So he took the courage to ask if he could actually be tried in that job, and he was actually accepted. And so that's how his career as a photojournalist began. And the opportunity for him to actually take a professional photo was when one of his supervisors in that Hell Studio was not around. And there was a horse race then that was supposed to be happening. And at that time, Hell Studio, I think, had a contract with the Standard newspaper, then the only newspaper in Nairobi. The Nation had not yet arrived. The Star had not yet arrived in town. It was only the Standard newspapers. So he was asked, because in the absence of this photographer from the Hell Studio who was supposed to supply those photos, he was actually asked to go and take those photos. And he took these amazing photos on that occasion.
Yeah.
And they just realized that this was a great photographer. But of course, as you say, at that time, Kenya was still under the British colonial rule, and those segregations, you know, the British, the Asians, and the Africans were so prominent.
Yeah.
So he had to struggle and weave himself through.
Through all that.
Yeah.
Now that brings me to the whole issue of building trust with the people that you go to take pictures of, and especially some of these world leaders that he got to interact with. How do you think he was able to build such trust to a point where they're actually going on a foreign trip, especially with the emperor? He used to go with him on personal trips.
Yes.
Building that trust.
I think the most important thing I would say about that is that Mohinder had an extraordinary capacity for transcending his origins. Of course, he was an Asian by birth, but he never represented the Asian community in his work.
Yeah.
He never represented any particular ethnic interest. He always represented humanity as a whole.
Yeah.
And so I use the expression, he transcended his origins. He was a human being first and foremost. And as I said before, because he had no pretensions.
Yeah.
His lack of formal education possibly assisted him in this respect. He didn't know how to be anybody except himself. So whether he was dealing with Haile Selassie or Jomo Kenyatta, whom he knew very well, he did a series of photographs of him with the British Queen, he didn't know how to ingratiate himself. He would just be Mohinder. And he was exactly the same. Another film I made with him was about the bomb blast in 1998.
Yeah.
We were dealing with people from very humble walks of life who'd lost their sight or lost their limbs or become permanently scarred. He didn't change his demeanor at all. Whether he was dealing with the head of state or whether he was dealing with that person, he never altered his demeanor. And I think that's how you win trust. There was nothing phony about Mohinder.
But
you were
being a
always dealing
genuine
with the
self,
real deal.
He was always genuine when telling his story and interacting with all these world leaders.
Exactly. So, despite the fact that, yes, of course there was racial segregation before independence in Kenya, and of course after that, when he went to Southern Africa, that continued long after the early 1960s, right up until the late 70s in Rhodesia, as it then was, and South Africa, of course, after that. He never carried any bitterness about that. In that respect, you can compare him with Nelson Mandela. He never, ever carried a chip on his shoulder about how he'd been treated before.
Yeah.
And of course, because his clients, many of his clients were in London, many of his closest associates, like John Snow, a very well-known British broadcaster, were British. And he never carried any bitterness whatsoever, because he always had a capacity for seeing who you were. He never looked at the surface. He always had a capacity for seeing who you were underneath.
And do you think that's one of the traits that actually made him not, go public? When you go back, looking back at the Ethiopian famine of 1984, he didn't get the credit, to start with until much later. Do you think that's one of his traits that actually helped him?
Definitely. He never allowed himself to get in the way of the story.
Yeah.
The story was always more important than he was. He was the lens through which the story passed. He was the vessel through which the story passed. He wasn't interested in stardom. He wasn't interested in self-promotion. He was the individual who carried the story to the viewer as objectively as possible. And one thing I should say is that he was also very, very careful not to be excessively voyeuristic. He catalogued a huge amount of human suffering in his lifetime, but he never crossed the barrier which would compromise a human being's dignity. He was very, very good at giving the viewer as much as they needed to know, without being excessively graphic in what he was doing.
And what do you think that says about him as not only just a photojournalist, but as a journalist as a whole, compared to what we see in this day and time?
Yeah, I think first I would actually just want to emphasize that point that Richard has just responded to, and of course coming from your question about the Ethiopian famine. The truth of the matter is that, of course, there was another Kenyan journalist, photojournalist called Mohamed, who is actually been celebrated as the photographer who actually did that job. They did together. But the truth of the matter is, if you want to go to history, is that when the first images of that Ethiopian famine first took the attention of the world, they were actually the photos of Sir Mohinder Dhilloh. And this, none other than the biographer of Mohamed himself acknowledges in the biography of Mohamed that when Sir Mohinder first took those photos, in 1983, 1984, Mohamed was actually traveling. He was actually doing a television series for an American television for the rich, called The Rich and the Famous.
Okay.
And then after that, he was actually traveling to Germany at Frankfurt to promote some of his book work. photography work. So in essence, it was Mohinder who was the first to give or to show the world the ravages of the famine that was happening in Ethiopia. Now, to your question, I think Mohinder brought a certain grace and character to the field of journalism. Even in his retirement, many times when I would actually go to visit him at home, he was always, receiving a stream of friends and colleagues that he had worked with through the decades, just coming to see him because they understood that this was actually the gentle giant of television journalism in the country.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot for us to learn from there. And like Richard Vaughan says, that he understood that his job was actually supposed to be the medium through which the stories were told. He never wanted to interfere with the story.
He would rather take a step back and let the story thrive and send the message home.
Yes, unlike what is happening today, where my generation of journalists and those ones who are coming after me, they think that they are the subject.
My story.
Your story. Yeah, which is, so there's a lesson to learn from Mohinder, and especially from somebody who worked with him for almost 30 years, Richard Vaughan, when he said that he kept to the background, but he gave the world what the world wanted to know.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then what it needed to see.
Yes.
Now, in your time working with him, did you ever get to see Death Wish Dhillon in action?
Luckily, I never went into any real war zones with him.
Okay.
I went into many areas where there was a lot of human suffering. I mean, the Nairobi bomb blast was one such instance. We made a film together called True Terror, which was about the aftermath of that particular incident, and it was shown on ITV in the UK and around the world, and was actually nominated for a Prix Italia that year for the best documentary film in the world for that year. So we saw an awful lot of human suffering at that time. I remember one of the first occasions I worked with him was in Western Uganda, and I filmed many births in my time, many children coming into the world. And I remember we filmed a young woman giving birth in a very, very remote rural hospital. And she spoke no English or Kiswahili. We spoke no Bakonjo, which was the language in that part of the world. And I remember this lady, it was very clear she was quite terrified of what was going on, because we were bringing in all the lights and the gear and everything. And she thought there was some gynecological complication. And we had to find some way through a medium of putting at her ease.
Yeah.
And I always remember Mohinder saying, look, we've got to give this lady some dignity. Let's not film the business end of what's happening. We'll film up here, and can we please make sure her breasts are covered, He was very, very considerate. So we filmed this child coming into the world, but you never saw anything too graphic.
Yeah.
And the whole point of that story was this was a child being born in 1990. What's the world going to look like when this child is 20 years old? What are the demographics of the world going to look like? And it was a pre-title sequence for a film that we were making for the BBC at that time. But he had the utmost consideration for people who were quite powerless in his presence. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know who I was. And this poor young lady was surrounded by wires and lights and God knows what else.
Yeah.
She had no control over what was going on. We had the hospital's consent, of course. But he was very, very careful to respect her dignity.
He did
to make
notice
sure
her
that,
unrest.
I beg your pardon?
He noticed her unrest and acknowledged it and
we both
respected
did.
it.
It was inevitable. I mean, it was unavoidable.
Yeah.
But he was very, very careful to do his best to put her at her ease and to make sure that she wouldn't feel embarrassed or ashamed or in any way regretful if she were to watch that back 20 years later and think, oh, my gosh, I wish I hadn't allowed that to happen.
Yeah.
He was extremely respectful.
Yeah.
Whatever walk of life his subjects came from.
Now, you have mentioned that, during your time working with him, you saw a lot of human suffering as you traversed the world, just filming all these stories. Do you think at any point all this human suffering sort of made him want to take a step back from doing what you were doing? It kept him going?
He was profoundly affected
Yeah.
by the famine in Ethiopia, where he saw people, very often very young children, infants, dying literally every few seconds. And he said for months, years afterwards, he would have nightmares. He would wake up in the night in a sweat, remembering all that suffering. So that was a huge burden on him, which I think he carried to his grave. He never forgot that assignment. He was there for about 18 months, on and off. And that really did take a very, very heavy toll on him.
Yeah.
In some ways, I think he was hardened to it. He knew how to be a little bit like being a doctor in casualty. At some point, you can't operate on everybody as if it's your own mother. You've got to build a protective shell around yourself for your own sanity. But the Ethiopian famine is something he could never have forgotten. And that I do know disturbed him enormously. But when he and I worked together, he was always the cool customer. I'm afraid I'm a rather intense and emotional person by nature. But he was always the steadying hand, which was a tremendous help to me when I was dealing with people in that kind of situation.
All right. And we're going to be running for you some images of Mohinder with him in action, his family. So you will be seeing them on your screen as we proceed with this discussion. But let me come to you also. When it comes to some of these things that we see as journalists, and especially what he's seen, just from what Mr. Vaughan is saying, what do you make of that, about his persona and the fact that he still kept going regardless of what impact it had on him emotionally, psychologically?
Yeah, I think first, you know, maybe I should mention this, that in 1961, Mohinder Dhilloh founded one of the most iconic news agencies at that time. I think perhaps the only one to actually spring from the continent of Africa, Africa Pix. And he was able to do this with a friend of his called Ivor Davis, who was a British trained journalist who had actually come sometimes in 1958 to work at the Standard newspapers. And then shortly after, Ivor Davis resigned from the Standard. And then together with Mohinder Dhilloh, they started this iconic news agency, Africa Pix. And it is through now that Africa Pix that he was, because of what Richard has actually just told us, that he was such an excellent photographer, and he knew the images that would actually tell the story. And so he's a gentleman who was actually hopping from one place to the other. At that time, that was the decade of Africa's independence. So Mohinder almost covered all independence, you know, the celebrations and all that. So he was just there. So I think he understood that he had such a responsibility, because sometimes we say that when you're a journalist, if you're a columnist or you're a presenter of a program, you understand that there are many other people who would actually be occupying that position. But then the world has been made in such a way that all of us cannot be there. So when you occupy that position, you know that it is a position of responsibility. And I think subconsciously, Mohinder understood that he had a certain responsibility for humanity. And that's why he would actually risk his life to go and capture some of these images and give them to the world. Of course, maybe later on the program we'll actually talk about, you know, the many occasions when he actually had a very close brush with death. Richard Vaughan has actually just mentioned one there when he survived a plane crash in Tanzania. But there are many before, even the famous one where he actually came close to being executed in the Congo. Before that, he had actually been arrested in South Africa because he had taken the photo of then South Africa's President Hendrik Verwoerd, where he was addressing a public rally, and then somebody tried to assassinate him. And it was only Mohinder who captured that scene.
And you think after all that he would want to just say, yo, this is too risky.
Yes, because they arrested him after that, when they realized that there's this photographer who is actually captured the image of this man actually being assassinated, or with an assassination attempt with a bullet wound. And when they realized, and they didn't want that one to be shown out, so they actually arrested him. And then they took the photo, they destroyed those images, and then they warned him. You know, he was actually deported from South Africa and warned not to go there and make that monkey business with this camera. You can imagine,
you know,
because that was before 1964 in Congo, and that was even before what Richard has actually just described when he went to Aden in Yemen to cover the civil war, where bullets were flying, and he was there actually capturing those stories. So he was a man, like Richard says, a man of physical courage, but he understood that he had a certain responsibility as a journalist or as a photojournalist to tell these stories to the world and document them for generations of journalists to come.
Kenyatta the late was right to call him a good dictator in whatever capacity we choose to interpret that. But that just brings in, you know, the role that his family had to play in all this. His late wife, you know, he did say at one point that her allowing him to go and capture all these stories is one of the reasons that kept him going. But, you know, just looking at the role that his family had to play from your interaction with him, how do you think that intertwined with his photojournalism career?
Okay, I think if you're married to whether you're a husband or a wife to a photojournalist, you're going to have to expect them to be away for long periods.
Yeah.
And of course, for most of Mohinder's career, cell phone technology didn't exist. So there was physical absence. You couldn't even talk on the phone. What communication there was by telex in those days. Ambi, his first wife, was very understanding of this, very supportive. It was an arranged marriage in the Indian tradition, Punjabi tradition. It wasn't a marriage by choice, but luckily it worked out very well for him. She died very young, unfortunately.
Yeah.
His son Sam, whom I also know very well, followed in his footsteps. Mohinder, I think, had wanted him to become a doctor or a lawyer or something comparatively safe, but Sam had got the bug. Sam had got the bug, and even today, I was just a couple of weeks ago, I was with Sam in South Sudan filming. So Sam's carrying on the tradition. But it's a calling. You know, this is not something you do for money. It's not something you do for self-aggrandizement. It's something you do because you feel you have to. You have to get a message across to people. Where there's human suffering, where there is injustice, where there is a wrong that needs to be righted. Even if it presents you with physical danger, it's something you feel you have to do.
Yeah.
You don't really have a choice. Fate is guiding you in that direction. So Ambi understood that very, very well, and so did Sam. And as I say, Sam is now following in his father's footsteps. Has been for a number of years.
Yeah. You also think, you know, the fact that, you know, his family was very understanding contributed to his journey, you know, just keeping him going?
Yes. Yeah, and I would actually quote Firoz Noriji, the famous lawyer. I remember once when he came on our program, I hosted him on the program when he actually wrote his book, Kenyan Journey. And I asked him that question actually, and he said that sometimes for you to succeed in whatever field, you always must have people behind you, people who are close to you, who are actually supportive of your ideals. And these are people who will actually allow you to do things, but they would also very quietly contribute to maybe with ideas, you know, just giving you that moral support. So I agree with Richard Vaughan that Mama Ambi, the wife, the first wife, Sam's mother, and the son, Sam himself, they are a great source of inspiration, and they gave him the moral support that he needed for him to continue going and bringing these stories to the world.
All right. Yeah. Now, here we have, you know, his memoir. It's a three-part story in 3 different books. And maybe tell us, when you were going or reading through this memoir, what was it telling you? How was it speaking to you about him, looking at his whole career as a whole, as a photojournalist from 1952 up until his resting recently?
I can actually say that, you know, as a presenter and producer of a literature program, just as you introduced to our viewers, I've read many books, and I read books every day to sustain that program. When I read Sam Mohinder's My Camera, My Life, I came to appreciate and know that, in fact, this is one of the most evocative memoirs that has ever been written. That's number one. But the story is not actually just the story of Sam Mohinder. When you read this book, you know, you actually get to know skills on interviewing, because he worked with many, many journalists around the world, whether it was from ITN or BBC or American, you know, media houses, or whether he was actually working with Richard Vaughan as a documentary filmmaker. So you get to know, you know, how they are preparing for this interview, and you know, the different approaches to doing an interview. Whether, you know, there are some subjects who are very tough or difficult to interview, and Sam Mohinder came across those, interviewing dictators. You know, you know, yes, you know. So it's actually what I would actually say, it's also a lesson in journalism. When you read this book, you get to learn quite about the field of journalism, how it was those days, and some of the lessons that you can actually pick even today and apply.
All right.
Yeah, it's an interesting book. I would actually, maybe Richard would actually tell us, because like Richard was saying, he was one of those people, because they were very close friends.
Yeah.
And it is through Sam Mohinder actually that I came to meet Richard Vaughan.
And also, I'd like to know your experience. Going through his memoir, I'm sure you learned things about him that you might have not previously known. But how does this memoir speak to you even today?
Well, I'm in it, so it's hard for me to be objective, maybe. Yes. Personally, there's an extraordinary amount of detail. It's more than 700 pages, and I was instrumental in getting the thing off the ground with other family and friends. It was very, very difficult to compress a life story of 50 years, even into 700 pages.
Yeah.
It's been more difficult still doing the new book, which is yet to be published, which is an illustrated one, which is much more digestible and in a much smaller format. It's going to be printed soon. Unfortunately, posthumously, I'm very sad that he's not to see it come out. I was just putting the finishing touches to it with him when he passed away. Your question, what insights does it provide into his character? I think he was extraordinarily patient. We've heard how he dealt with a lot of big people who can on occasions be breathtakingly arrogant,
yes.
I have to say, and one of the things that drives me nuts in this part of the world.
You seem to have experienced it
quite
a lot.
Well, I'll give an extreme example. Robin Day was a very, very well-known British journalist who flew from the UK to do an interview with Milton Obote, who was the president of Uganda at one time. He was president twice, in fact. And Mohinder and Sir Robin Day went to do this interview in Kampala, and he kept him waiting 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours. And eventually, as Obote was walking in and out of his office, Sir Robin stood up and said, "Mr. President, we had an appointment." And Obote replied, "Well, I've just broken it," and walked away. And that was when the man had flown out from Europe to do an interview by agreement. But even in this country, I'm sorry to say, you can have appointments with ministers and permanent secretaries and what have you. No respect whatsoever for your time. None whatsoever. And it costs money and it costs time, but I really feel that no matter how important you are, when you have an appointment with someone and you're due to speak with them and you're speaking to the world, please respect that appointment. One of the most professional people I've dealt with, by the way, was Kofi Annan.
Yeah.
I remember interviewing him at around the time when this country was about to melt down, and he was brokering a deal between Mwai Kibaki and Raila Odinga. I had an appointment with him. He was 10 minutes late, and he came down. He apologized to each and every one of us for keeping us waiting and said, "Now, where do you want me?" Now, that's professionalism, that's respect. But I'm afraid both Mohinder and I have experienced the opposite of that on far too many occasions.
Just to name but a few.
Yeah, but just to mention that, Richard is actually mentioned there, I think, a couple of times, that the book is actually, that they are putting together this book with Sir Mohinder Dhilloh. Unfortunately, the book is actually going to be published posthumously. It's a book that is called Witness to History.
Witness to History, yes.
Yeah, that is the title of the book. Yeah, I just wanted it out there. Witness to History, a book that now Richard Vaughan is actually forced to do it in the absence of his great friend Sir Mohinder Dhilloh. Yeah. So the book will come out posthumously.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And when can it be expected, at least for our viewers?
Well, it's very hard to say. I mean, I hope it'll be within a couple of months. I'm hoping. It was literally ready to go to press when Mohinder passed on. We were putting the final few touches to it a week last Monday, when Sam called me and said, "Don't come over. He's had to be admitted to hospital." And we were literally getting it ready to go to the printers. Yeah. So there'll be a little bit of a hiccup, but I hope it's going to be no more than a couple of months.
All right.
Yeah.
And he also spoke of some of his pieces having been taken by other media houses across the country, across the world, years back. What would you like to say to some of those people if they're watching us this morning? Those who have his photographs, iconic images that could go a long way in telling a story that needed to be told.
Well, I think the responsibility is going to fall to Sam, unfortunately, but I'll be there to help him.
Yeah.
Of course, there'll be dozens, if not hundreds, of images around the world that were done. Much of Mohinder's career, of course, we didn't have the technology to keep absolutely everything. These days, you can keep a library of images on your cell phone. You couldn't do that back in the 1960s.
Yeah.
But I'm sure when he started out, if he was filming for a client in Europe, he very often never saw the result of his work because it was shot on film, it was processed in London, or it was processed in the US, and it went out in those countries, and he never actually saw it.
And that was the end of it.
And that was the end of it. He was just doing a job, and he never got to saw the fruit of his labors, a lot of the time. Of course, that's all changed now. But I'm sure as as we, as archivists, start to put his work together, people will come out of the woodwork and say, yes, I've got these extraordinary images here, there, and everywhere.
In honor of his work.
Yes, in honor of his legacy. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Now, as we bring the conversation to close, maybe coming to you, what is it that, from your experience with Mohinder, you would like people to always remember him for?
One, I think, like I say, that he brought a certain grace and character to the field of journalism. Mm-hmm. He was very humble, he was a gentleman, and he shared his friends and contacts with his other friends. Mm. And he actually embraced people in spite of their class, tribe, race, or whatever a creed. That's how I became very close. You can imagine, the difference in age, okay? And I met him when he was already in his 80s, but we became these very close friends. And every now and then he would actually just call me and say that, oh, Khainga, I have a great friend of mine who is actually visiting from America or from the UK. I think he's a good subject for any of your programs at KBC. And then he would tease me, and I said that, so can you talk to him so that when I call him, he understands that I've been sent to him by you. And he said, no, I'll just give you the number. you do it, call first. If you are unable, then I can intervene. Yeah. So you'd actually just give me the number, and then you tell me that, Khainga, you go and call. So let me say two things. One, it was actually through Mohinder that I got to meet the great BBC journalist who is visiting us here today at KBC, the former BBC journalist Richard Vaughan. Because at that time we were actually doing a review of his memoir on the KBC English service. Mm-hmm. And because he had this speech impediment, like Richard Vaughan has actually told us, I made that decision. I knew that he was not one of those who was actually going to read excerpts from his memoir. Mm-hmm. So I asked him that, whom do you think he's actually going to read these excerpts? Because the nature of the program is that the discussion is actually interspersed with readings from the book. And he just told me that I have a friend of mine called Richard Vaughan. He's an ex-BBC journalist. I'll send you to him. And he gave me his driver and taxi to go to Richard Vaughan's office. So I went to Richard Vaughan, and that's how we met the first time. Okay. Now, to just show how great a mentor he was to me, was that one of the very latest interviews that I did on the Books Cafe was actually through Mohinder Dhilloh. Mm-hmm. He called me a few months ago, and he told me that, Khainga, I have a friend of mine who's just written a book. I want you to have a chat with him. And I asked him that, who is this? And he told me that he's an ex-colonial officer called Ralph Palmer. Mm-hmm. So he gave me the number, and I called Ralph Palmer, and I went to interview him, only to learn that Ralph Palmer was actually, he served in the pre-independence British government, and after independence he actually served in our first administration, the Jomo Kenyatta administration, up until 1969 when he retired from a public service. And he retired into a quiet life of writing. So he's written so many books. Can you imagine that I do a literature program? I'm always, trying to sniff around and see what is coming. But it was through Mohinder that I came to discover this journalist. So in short, I would say that Mohinder will remain a great source of inspiration to those of us who are joining journalism, to generations of journalists to come. He was a great photojournalist and a man of great courage. And, just that mentorship, he always understood that with this age, if you went to him, he would actually help you. He'll give you ideas of a story. It's even me, it's very difficult. Richard will tell you that in spite of age and our backgrounds, he was very close to me. He was a true friend and great mentor, and I feel that loss. It's huge. I feel that void, because now with him gone now, it means that there's something that is not going to work, because he would actually give me these contacts, great stories for KBC. Now that is gone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, coming to you, Mr. Vaughan, what is it that you want people to remember Sir Mohinder for? And of course, especially, and also our young photojournalists, what can they learn from this great?
He was far more than a camera operator. He was far more than a journalist. He was, first and foremost, an extraordinary human being. And he brought his incredible humanity to everything he did. So, yes, he was very, very good at mentoring people, very concerned if any friends or family were ill or sick or having financial difficulties or what have you. He would always call me and say, I'm worried about so-and-so, what can we do to help? He was extraordinary in that respect, very, very generous of spirit, not just materially generous. He wasn't a spectacularly wealthy man, but he would always give you his time. He would always give you his advice. He was never too big for anyone. He could have exploited his fame. He was known all around the world.
And the connections that he had.
And the connections he had. Yes, but he just was not that kind of person. He was far too shy and retiring for that. So what I would like people to remember Mohinder as was first and foremost a wonderful human being who transcended his origins. He was bigger than race. He was bigger than tribe. He was human first and foremost, and he brought that human touch to everything he did, both in his professional and his private capacity.
Yeah. So that is the least you can remember him for. If you did not know him, if you were trying to know about him, you can go ahead and grab a copy of his memoir, get to read about My Camera, My Life, and see life through his eyes, at least through his books, as we wait for the next book to come out. Well, that is all the time we had for this discussion. We have been speaking with a former BBC journalist and current managing director of Inca Africa, Mr. Richard Vaughan. Thank you for making time to be with us this morning.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And to my immediate left, we have Kainga Okwemba, who is a presenter and a producer here at the Broadcasting House, of course, working with the English service. Thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Jen.
All right. Now, we do have more coming up right here on Good Morning Kenya, but first, let's have a quick look at what is happening on our social media platforms as well as the situation on the roads. It is exactly 25 minutes to 8